It was only a matter of time before someone made a Civil War movie. But this movie isn't about a civil war. Not really, anyway. If you're living in or even observing modern America with open eyes, you won't need me or anyone else to tell you that the country's political, cultural, and even spiritual divisions are deepening and hardening by the day. And although the prospect of a full-scale military conflict between the US government and any potential seceding states is pretty unlikely to happen in the real world anytime soon, the never-ending American culture war continues to thrash and widen, which in turn has primed the American public for a movie like this to come along and turn our worst fears about each other and our polarized country into harrowing cinematic unreality. Which is why, when Alex Garland's Civil War was announced, most people were assuming that his film would at least attempt to interrogate some of those fault lines. You know, right versus left, rich versus poor, urban versus rural. But surprisingly, Civil War doesn't engage with these divisions at all. Instead, it drops viewers headfirst into the center of an already raging nationwide war we don't fully understand. And even more surprisingly, Garland seems to have absolutely no interest in helping us understand it. I mean, sure, we receive passing tidbits of background information, but instead of really delving into how or why Texas and California, of all states, decided to band together in bloody secession, or by what means the president was able to secure a third term in office or disband the FBI, Garland decides to shirk ideology and exposition altogether and show us a visceral portrait of civil warfare through the eyes and cameras of a ragtag group of war correspondents and photojournalists as they attempt to navigate their way to DC, hopefully becoming the first reporters to document and interview an American president under siege by his own constituents. So why did Garland choose to shoot the movie from such an unconventional perspective? I mean, nothing against photojournalists or anything, but if they're the only vantage point we're able to view this war from, we're probably going to have a pretty limited and incomplete comprehension of what's actually going on here and why. Because, as the movie correctly points out, the role of the photojournalist isn't to ask questions. It's simply documentation. Dispassionate, detached, and ideally objective documentation. If we can't actually hear from leaders or combatants in the conflict beyond crackly presidential sound bites and shouted battle commands, the political context of this war will always remain a mystery to us. And I'm gonna go out on a limb here, but in a Civil War movie, you'd think political context would be a pretty important thing to have, no? The film's steadfast refusal to engage with America's political or cultural differences to any degree could be interpreted as cowardice. After all, A24 spent more money producing this film than any other, immediately slashing its potential audience in half by turning it into some kind of partisan anti-Trumpist parable wouldn't exactly be the savviest financial decision for an indie film studio with clear aspirations to start batting in the big leagues. And undoubtedly, some people have already written this film off as a high-octane love letter to both sidesism and not much else. But I don't think cowardice was the reason Garland chose to exclude so many of the narrative and thematic elements any reasonable filmgoer would expect to see in a modern Civil War movie. I think it's more like Garland wanted to use the attention-grabbing Civil War iconography as a Trojan horse to traffic in some unexpected yet relevant and poignant themes about the way we internalize, normalize, and sublimate trauma, and how violence dehumanizes not only those engaging in the brutality, but also those bearing witness to it. Honestly though, it took me a hot minute to come to this charitable interpretation of the film, because initially, to me, it kind of felt like a well-shot, well-acted war movie with not much to say, and perhaps most importantly, an undeserved clickbaity title and promotional campaign. But before I got the chance to dismiss this movie entirely, as much of film Twitter seems to have done, I couldn't stop thinking about why Garland chose to center this film around photojournalism of all things. Beyond the fact that Garland clearly developed a lot of respect for this profession early in life due to his father's career as a political cartoonist and journalist, there had to have been a more concrete thematic justification for almost stubbornly turning what should have been a modern Civil War movie into a modern photojournalism movie. But But if we detach the label photojournalist from the protagonists here and simply judge these characters by their actions, they're just people attempting to observe and document tragically violent events. And it's only when we examine what this type of observation has done to them do we really start to suss out what Garland is actually trying to say with this film. Or at least what I think he's trying to say. To each of the four main characters, Garland assigns variations on core trauma responses. For Lee, we see the freeze response typified. Due to habitual exposure to violence throughout her apparently decades-long career, Lee has become world-weary and monotone, preferring to exist in a perpetual state of emotional paralysis rather than confront the bleak realities of the world she obsessively documents. Sammy, Lee's mentor, aligns most closely with the flight response. If Lee has seen it all, Sammy has seen it all twice and then some. His long career has gifted him with an acute sixth sense for danger, and he refuses to engage with any situation he knows is headed for a bad outcome. In Joel, Garland illustrates a common offshoot of the fight response. But instead of fighting against his trauma with aggression or physical violence, Joel fights it with gallows humor and thrill-seeking. Rather than allow the horrors of his world to consume him, he channels them into a blood-soaked adrenaline addiction. I actually think a lot of the film's unorthodox and upbeat soundtrack choices were selected to kind of give us a peek into the way Joel in particular responds to trauma, by pretending like it's awesome. But it's with our youngest protagonist, Jesse, where things get really interesting. As a young buck up-and-comer to this life, Jesse hasn't yet experienced enough trauma to respond to it in any reliably patterned way. So instead of Garland assigning her a generalized type, he allows us to watch her responses to trauma evolve as she's exposed to more and more of it throughout the film. When we're first introduced to Jesse, the bombing in New York and the rendezvous with the Pittsburgh gas station sickos results in her displaying a flop response, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically what anyone would do in her specific circumstances. But then, as she gains experience and deals with horrifically life-threatening events like hanging out with Todd from Breaking Bad, she starts to plant herself more firmly in a different camp. Instead of putting emotional walls up like Lee, she builds a dependency on her trauma, like Joel. She gets off on it. Why else would she be smiling and laughing while ducking gunfire in the middle of her nation's capital? However, in the film's final frames, she pays something of a twisted homage to her new mentor. By completely ignoring Lee's selfless sacrifice in favor of snapping a career and country-defining photograph, she ironically exhibits the same kind of emotional callousness that Lee has used as a protective casing for her entire career. In Civil War, I think Garland is using the passive indifference and detached observation that his characters so often deploy as a comment on not only the way photojournalists internalize trauma, but the way we all do. In the past few years, the incessant stream of bad news, bad wars, bad guys, and bad vibes has turned almost everyone into either an active observer or unfortunate victim of political tragedy. But for those of us living in America, we're generally pretty removed from this stuff. We observe it, we internalize it, and then our personalities and experiences dictate how we respond to it. Do we run away from it? Do we consume it like entertainment and get addicted to it? Or do we put up a numb facade to shield ourselves from the horror of it? Maybe a little of all three. There's been a common take I've seen since this film's release that expresses confusion as to why Garland chose to make this a war movie set in modern America and not a war movie set in a more predictable or believable time and place. And while sure, I think the whole clickbaity promotional campaign probably played into his decision from a business perspective, but when you view the text he's presenting through the lens of dissecting who gets to observe tragedy and who is forced to live through it, it kinda all starts to fall into place. Because here in America, we're always the ones who get to turn the violent removal of political leaders into content, artwork, and jokes and memes.
My favorite video on the internet right now is of Gaddafi getting captured by the Libyan rebels. But what really makes it special is the part where one of them takes out a utility knife and repeatedly jams it up Gaddafi's ass.
But it's been a really long time since we've had to grapple with that kind of political upheaval in our country, where we're the ones who have to feel the repercussions of it. To me, Civil War's biggest goal, and I think it succeeds in this by the way, is to transform the audience and the main characters from physically unaffected, distant observers to genuine political victims of unspeakable tragedy that actually have some real skin in the game. For example, I saw this movie in a strip mall attached to a JCPenney, and despite the fact that this film contains numerous harrowing depictions of unfathomable violence and brutality, there was nothing that shook me more than seeing Lee and Jesse have a casual conversation in a war-torn JCPenney parking lot, virtually indistinguishable from the one my car was parked in. Because as long as violence and desolation are happening far away from your backyard, no matter how empathetic or compassionate you are, they'll always be a sort of unfortunate abstraction to you. But Civil War forces us to envision an America where that unfortunate abstraction has become an inescapable reality. We wouldn't get to be the passive observers anymore. We'd be in it. And is there any future more legitimately terrifying than that? So in closing, even though I didn't get the movie I wanted, I still think it tried sometimes, and ultimately, I got what I need. Thank you so much for watching. I would definitely recommend going to see Civil War on the biggest screen you can. Like and subscribe to see more videos like this, and I'll catch y'all soon.